Hi there, welcome to Active Intelligence. I'm Aaron Ironside. I hope you can spend the next half an hour with me as we take a look at the issues affecting our nation, our community. And this one has been brewing for a long time. And finally, as a culture, we want to say no more smoking. Smokefree 2025. It's a lofty goal, but is it impossible? Find out today on Active Intelligence. On today's episode, I caught up with Professor Chris Bullen. He's a public health expert who's focused his career on the harmful effects of cigarette smoking, and he is one who still believes that Smokefree 2025 is worth having a tilt at. It does seem rather lofty, aspirational, I think is the word they use, which is kind of code for a bit of a pipe dream, no pun intended. Well, our Prime Minister is still convinced it's worth aiming for Smokefree 2025.
We know that half of those who take up smoking die from its effects. And I think everyone's in agreement that we need to do more to try and reduce down people taking up smoking in the first place. And if they are smoking, to find safe alternatives and ways for them to quit. And that's what this is all about. Here there's a line in the sand that we are drawing today to say continuing to increase prices will not at this point continue to help people stop smoking. And so now we need to look at the alternatives. We've done as much as we can there, and this action plan is about the what next.
Why not just do vaping at the same time?
Well, of course, we've already got the vaping framework. We've already see vaping being used by people as a tool to stop smoking. And that actually enables us to push ahead with further activity to reduce down smoking because there is an alternative that works very successfully for people in order to stop smoking. We know that vaping is making a difference for those now in order to stop smoking, and so it is an important tool. And look, I'm sure that there will be those who want to have a say on the use of vaping amongst young people in the future. We're very much focused here in this action plan on ensuring that people do not take up smoking in the first place.
I suppose the obvious question is, why do people still smoke? I mean, we've tried so often to warn them about the health effects of smoking. You'd think dying, half of those who smoke dying from smoking would be enough. Maybe taxation would do the trick. Cigarettes are incredibly expensive, but even the smokers don't think that's going to work.
In terms of getting people to quit, I don't think it's going to work. I think more or less the crime rate and possibly black market tobacco industry is going to boom. The power of addiction's a lot more powerful than the power of money, you know.
Mario Cooper likes the idea of e-cigarettes to help bring down the smoking rates, but he says there needs to be more support to give up, not more tax hikes from the government.
It's interesting that this issue, like so many others, turns out to be one that targets the vulnerable. It's a great shame that Māori and Pacifica are well overrepresented in the stats around smoking, and that's why Honi Harawira, who has been part of this government think tank on this topic, is convinced that if you're going to start anywhere, you have to start with affecting those who are most deeply affected by the issue.
Some of the things I'd like to see are, one, prioritise Māori and Pacifica in all campaigns to do with smoke-free, because a bit like COVID, a bit like health issues, a bit like everything else, Māori and Pacifica always end up getting the wrong end of the stick and end up carrying the can at the end of the day. I heard you mention 11% for the nation. I think we're still at Māori and Pacifica up around 20-30%, so a lot of work to be done there. Reduce the access, identify where they're selling cigarettes, put them into different classes. Like you've got small dairies and garages, for example, that get robbed. So those are the ones you want to say, look, next March we're going to shut down smoking. You've got until then to restock with other product, and then we're going to shut you down for that. And then, because people don't rob the big guys like Countdown and Pack and Save and places like that. So you do the little ones first and then the bigger ones later. And at the same time, you have to bring in tobacco and vaping product sales venues. So because it's an addiction, it's not just something you can take away. It's an addiction, and people need to be helped to get through this. So you've got to have approved retailers where people can buy, although a lesser number and lesser as we go through until 2025. The key to the exercise is to make sure that we are dealing with the addiction as well as handling the problem.
Now, Honi Harawira reckons that all the cigarette companies should be sued, but of course he's also the one who's pointed out that it's the cigarette companies who have morphed their business from traditional cigarette smoking into vaping or e-cigarettes, and they are prolific. They are everywhere. Our young people are using these e-cigarettes, vaping everywhere. Of course, we also know from the overseas model that it's being used to vape cannabis products as well as tobacco ones. And whilst it's true that vaping is less harmful than cigarettes, as one expert points out, that's by no means the same as saying it's safe.
And if you talk to most experts, and I agree with them, the question is, is vaping better than smoking? Yes. But is vaping safe? No. Those are two very distinct questions. Vaping absolutely is not safe. Now, one of the products, the most popular one, is called Juul, and I'm not picking on them. They just happen to be the most popular one. If you look at all of the pods they use that have the different products that they actually vape, the chemicals, each one of those products has nicotine in it. Nicotine is extremely addictive, especially for the teen brain that's developing. On top of that, there's a lot of chemicals in there. When the product burns, they get put into the lungs. And one thing we learned in medical school, and this was a basic thing we learned year one, you don't want to put anything into your lungs because it's going to cause problems somewhere down the road. The problem with these products are we don't know what's going to happen because they're so new, and especially the fact that teenagers are using them. On top of that, other surveys have come out showing that teenagers are actually substituting cannabis or marijuana liquid into those pods and using it at alarming amounts.
So there you go. That's really all of our tactics in one go at the moment for Smokefree 2025, which targets cigarette smoking and not vaping. Vaping seen as a tool to wean people off cigarettes. We've got the exorbitant taxation of cigarette smoking to try and dissuade people. Really all that does is cripple the poor cigarette smokers. They become addicts and broke as well. And we know that for whatever reason, the fact that the health effects perhaps are so far away from the act of actually smoking a cigarette that they don't seem to do the trick either. And yet we continue to press on towards Smoke-Free 2025. Can it really happen? Well, Professor Chris Bullen is one who's been hoping for something like this. His whole career, he has spent his life becoming an expert on the public health effects of smoking.
Well, I've been interested in finding out ways to help more smokers quit and live a longer and healthier life for almost 2 decades. And I've been involved with as a clinician, as a GP, and then as a researcher. And e-cigarettes came across my desk in an email from a colleague in Christchurch in about 2007, I think. He was aware that there was a product developed in China and wondered with my group at the University of Auckland would be interested in testing to see how they compared with nicotine replacement therapy and so forth. So we got underway with research on these pretty pathetic looking products which looked very much like the size and shape of a normal cigarette but had a very small battery, small little container for nicotine liquid in them, and tested them. We published that research. It was the first paper ever published on the subject. And then we managed to get some funding to do a very large trial comparing the next generation of e-cigarettes by then, because these are quite rapidly evolving products, comparing them with nicotine patches in about 660 New Zealand smokers who wanted to quit smoking. And that was published in a journal called The Lancet in 2013 and attracted a lot of international attention and enabled us to continue doing more research in this space since then. So I've been actively involved in research and trying to amass the best evidence around whether e-cigarettes help people to quit smoking and whether they're safe, as part of a bigger body of work around trying to control the problem of tobacco smoking in New Zealand and overseas.
So we know that there are a couple of major approaches in the public health domain to convincing people to give up. One is the scare tactic, the TV ads that show the horrible effects that smoking has on your lungs. And then, of course, it's just the taxing of cigarettes so that they get just so expensive that it's hard to imagine anyone could afford to be a smoker. Do either of those tactics really work? Is one the winner?
Well, tax is no doubt the winner. So price is absolutely there is robust evidence from every country in the world where it's been studied that if you increase the price of cigarettes, people don't take up smoking, and people who are smokers think about quitting and actually do quit. So the more you put up the price, the more challenging it is, as you said, to be able to afford it, especially since in many countries, most smokers are people on the lowest incomes. And partly that's due to their smoking addiction and the price of tobacco. But also they may have allied health problems which make it hard for them to get good employment and so forth. So smoking is a cause of poverty, but it's also a sort of symptom of wider poverty for people. The fear tactics certainly do work. There's good evidence. That's why we've got horrible pictures on our cigarette packets. That's all based on excellent research conducted in different populations all around the world. And whilst these things work not in a dramatic way, they all add up incrementally to dissuade people from continuing to smoke or just take up smoking. And so you put them all together. It's all about a comprehensive range of strategies acting together to present questions in front of people who are smokers or people contemplating smoking. So why would I bother to do this? It's going to kill me, and it'll cost me a huge amount of money.
You'd think just the mere information that it would kill you would be enough, but it does seem that cost may be even more powerful than the health threat. I mean, does that surprise you as a medical professional that people don't even seem to care about their well-being as much as their wallet?
Not really, because people often are dealing in the immediate rather than the distant threat. And so the idea of when you're 20, you're dying from lung cancer at 45 or 50 seems like something for old people that you don't have to worry about, and you'll be able to take control of your issues before it becomes a problem, is the kind of mindset I think that people have. Most smokers start smoking in their teens, right? So when they're invincible and life looks bright, and being someone in their 40s or 50s with lung disease is just not on their radar. So I think, unfortunately, people come to that realization that smoking is killing them when it literally is starting to impact on their ability to function normally, to walk up a hill, to do all the sort of things that they enjoy in life. Good news is, of course, you can stop smoking at any stage, even if you've got lung cancer, and you actually have a better outcome from stopping smoking, even when you're quite sick from smoking-related illness. But the reason why I think people struggle with quitting so much is because it's incredibly addictive. First of all, there's nicotine in tobacco, which is a chemical addiction, but there's also the sort of physical addiction, the social addiction, peer support to continue smoking, cues in your environment that make you immediately think about smoking because you're having a drink of beer. You always had a smoke with your drink. So dissociating those things, it's extremely difficult. So there are a lot of reinforcers that make it extremely difficult for people to quit. And most people try 15 to 20 times before they actually succeed.
Well, I know that all too well as a former smoker, and I realised myself that until I decided that I was a non-smoker rather than someone trying to give up smoking, I was never going to manage that because somehow a smoker giving up inevitably is going to go back. When I was giving up, of course, the other alternatives that are now very popular didn't exist. We noticed the rise of the shisha cafe and that whole sort of cultural expression of smoking that seems to be popular among young people, and in particular, of course, now the vaping, the vape shop. And with that, kind of the belief that on the one hand, this might be a tool for giving up, but at the very least, it's not as bad as smoking cigarettes itself. But is that even true?
You raise a couple of things there. First, just to mention about shisha or water pipes, nargile, whatever you want to call them. They've got a host of names. These are the bubbling apparatuses that people sit out in front of cafes and puff on and share them around. These are incredibly puff, much more harmful than smoking cigarettes. So just in case people think that the fact that the smoke sort of bubbles through water doesn't mean it's any safer. It's incredibly concentrated, combusted tobacco going over charcoals, generating smoke and mixed with flavors. So fortunately, it's very rare. People don't do it 10 times, 20 times a day. It tends to be a one-off sort of social activity. But it is certainly a very harmful behavior, and I think it needs to be people just need to know that. They don't. We've done surveys of university students in New Zealand and found that most of them don't have a clue. So that's number one, but much more popular than shisha and much more commonly used now is what you talked about with e-cigarettes or vapes. And the evidence around whether vapes sort of puff for puff are less harmful than cigarettes, I think is reasonably compelling. They certainly don't contain the vast number of damaging chemicals that cigarette smoke has in it. That's not to say they are completely harmless, but they are, from all the best science that I have looked at over a long time, whilst some studies show some harmful ingredients in the vape cloud that people inhale, they tend to be in very low quantities. Vapor doesn't contain carbon monoxide, which is one of the products of cigarette smoking, combustion of cigarettes, which can promote heart attacks. And they don't contain the same levels of cancer-causing substances in general compared to cigarette smoke. So puff-for-puff cigarette smoking is incredibly dangerous, and in the short and long term. If you've got a dodgy heart, smoking's a really bad idea. It can cause a heart attack, kind of acutely from just that smoking episode. But in the longer term, it damages your lungs, your blood vessels, and so on. But vaping, we don't have 20 years of information on vapors, and their exposure is incredibly variable, and the product range is hugely diverse. So it's hard to kind of compare apples and oranges, but what we know on first principles is that there are very few components in vapor compared with the cocktail that's in tobacco smoke, and people vape differently than they do with cigarettes. So people tend not to take in the same kind of volumes of product. The other thing about e-cigarettes is you don't have, they don't kind of continue to discharge vapor when you're not puffing on them, whereas a cigarette that's lit continues to smoke. And that smoke that comes off the cigarette is particularly toxic to other people, whereas the only kind of second-hand vape a person could be exposed to is if they're in the same room as somebody who's blowing out vapor clouds. And the evidence around that being particularly harmful is that it's certainly nowhere near as harmful as second-hand cigarette smoke.
Some will say, oh, good, so we should vape. Yeah. Are you really advocating for vaping?
No, not really. But what I would say, and this is backed up by the Ministry of Health here in New Zealand, which is if you're a smoker and you've tried every other way to quit smoking and it just hasn't worked for you, you need to think about considering vaping as a means to quitting smoking, and then only vape for as long as you need to, and then think about quitting vaping. Vaping isn't something that I would recommend for people who don't smoke. It's certainly a tool that has helped many people to quit smoking. I think the evidence is supportive in general, but there are some caveats around that. And it's not something for non-smokers. It's for people who try to quit smoking. And they've tried, nicotine patches and gum. They might have tried Champix or Zyban or these other pharmaceutical products. And if those haven't worked, then, you're walking a tightrope with continuing to smoke. So I would say in that situation, give vaping a go. But you need some good advice about what vapes to get and make a plan for thinking about weaning yourself off the vapes.
What's popcorn lung? This thing I've heard about it sounds like something at the movies, but I very much doubt that popcorn lung is something you want to watch with your favourite flick.
Your popcorn lung is sort of one of those terms that's become a bit of a meme, I think. And really all it is a lung condition that results from exposure to a chemical called diacetyl, which is used to give food products, particularly popcorn, a buttery flavour. And it was noticed in workers working in popcorn factories who are exposed to large amounts of diacetyl over long periods of time. There have been a few case reports of people who use e-cigarettes developing popcorn lung, although it hasn't been absolutely nailed. But what is less commonly known is that there's vastly more diacetyl found in normal cigarette smoke than there is in e-cigarette vape. So again, this could be a headline of a newspaper saying, vaping gives you popcorn lung. But actually, if you look behind the headline at the science, there are very few cases which would meet the criteria for true popcorn lung of people who are vapors. And it's much more likely if you're a smoker that you'll get popcorn lung than a vapor. So again, it's a kind of relative discussion here. We're not saying that vaping is a great idea, because you are exposing yourself to some risk, but the risk compared to smoking is less.
Of course, those who vape aren't always vaping tobacco products. We know that cannabis products now are being used as well, and even smoking cannabis, inhaling cannabis smoke. A lot of cannabis users are equally under the impression that this is not very harmful either. What's the truth about using vaping for cannabis and the effects of cannabis from a lung condition point of view?
Yeah, well, I would be very cautious about trying to vape cannabis oil. In fact, there's a condition called, it's been given the name EVALI, E-V-A-L-I again. It went into the headlines a year or two ago, where some people, backyard operators in Los Angeles, were mixing cannabis oil with vitamin E acetate to try and make it vapable. And they made a batch which went around, over the internet and was distributed throughout North America, and a whole bunch of people started using this product. And the vitamin E acetate is incredibly bad for your lungs. And these people ended up in intensive care units on ventilators, and a few people died. So this was given the name EVALI, and it's since been used by people who are completely opposed to vaping of any way, shape, or form, to suggest that vaping is dangerous. But I think this was what we call a point source outbreak. As soon as the factory which made this stuff was shut down, the little epidemic disappeared, and there have been very few cases that fit the criteria for EVALI registered anywhere in any healthcare adverse reactions monitoring system in the world since then. So that's not to say that people can't get bad, lung problems from vaping. In fact, that's why you have to be careful and go to a reputable vape store if you're going to go vaping, and get some really good advice and use registered products. And the Ministry of Health has now got some regulations and processes in place to try and provide some quality assurance, because just buying any old thing at any old price over the internet isn't a great idea, because you've just no idea where it was made, the quality of manufacturing, etc. You need to go somewhere where you can get a reputable product and get some reasonable advice. And the Ministry of Health website gives people some direction around that.
Well, finally today, we're supposed to be smoke-free by 2025. I'm presuming that includes vaping. Does it? And is there any real chance that we are going to be smoke-free?
It's a great question. I'm really engaged in terms of trying to make that a reality. I think it's a wonderful ambition that our government has put in place, for successive governments, not just the current government. It's been something we're very unified on in New Zealand, is to have this aspiration of reaching smoking down below 1 in 20 people, or 5% or lower, by the year 2025. That's only a few years away now, and we are heading in that direction. In fact, the latest data on smoking has shown a real step down across all population groups in the last couple of years, which is surprising, because you might think during COVID, smokers might have been tempted, or people might have been tempted to take up smoking, but maybe the fear of getting a lung disease like COVID has driven smokers to quit and stopped people who might be contemplating it from starting. But I think it's achievable, but we are going to have to take some bold action. In fact, I think e-cigarettes are part of the solution. In fact, that step down that's occurred in smoking prevalence has coincided with a step up in vaping. And what I think has happened, although I can't be absolutely sure on this, is that many smokers have switched to vaping, and that's why we've seen that step. So I think vaping's part of the solution, but I'm not advocating that non-smokers take it up. I'm thinking it's a tool for smokers to quit smoking and to save their lives. But so the 2025 goal is for smoking, because it's absolutely the most dangerous form of dealing in nicotine products, it's burning leaf and inhaling the smoke from that burning leaf. It's like standing around an open fire and sucking all that stuff into your lungs, which isn't a great idea when you think about it. Vaping is a little bit more pure. It's a bit more like, getting some Vicks in a stainless steel bowl and inhaling that. It's a lot more less exposure to a whole range of cocktail of toxic ingredients. So I think it will be one of many tools, promotion of families to go smoke-free together, the price of tobacco becoming a real issue as inflation rises in New Zealand. The relative cost of tobacco addiction will be relatively higher for people. The warnings, the government's proposing limiting the number of retailers selling the products. The age at which you can purchase tobacco is likely to be limited, and you may not be able to buy it if you're born after a certain year. And the government's actually thinking about removing the nicotine from all tobacco products as part of its package of strategies. So I think this could shift people away from smoking quite dramatically, quite quickly, if we are able to get these actions in place in the next year or two.
Professor Chris Bullen, I think in the end, conceding defeat that whilst we can't have an entire smoke-free 2025, we can target the cigarette smoking. I'm just not convinced that seeing the smokers move from cigarettes to vaping is really going to be that effective in the end. But look, we understand just how incredibly dangerous cigarette smoking is, but clearly vaping is not good for your lungs either. I don't know if you've ever sat beside someone in the car in front of you vaping, and this big waft of smoke billows out of their window, and you think, how does one human being consume that kind of, steam, of course, rather than smoke is what the e-cigarettes are. But nonetheless, human lungs were made for oxygen. So you know that anything other than oxygen is probably going to have a negative downstream effect. The only difference is we don't know what it is. So it seems that the shame of all of this is that we might simply be trading one known problem for an unknown one. And maybe in another 20 years' time, we'll have to have vape-free 2045. I don't know. What would it take to actually give up smoking? Well, I was interested to hear Hone Harawira answer the question about how he became a former smoker.
I was a smoker until I was about 35, I think. And then an uncle of mine died. And he was a huge mentor to many of us. Māori Marston was his name. And he died from smoking. And I was so bloody angry with him that on the day he died, I walked around kicking things over and swearing and yelling and crying and just being angry with him. And by the end of the day, I was still so angry and then as I started to calm down, I realized I hadn't had a cigarette. And so I thought, oh, there it is. There's my legacy. There's the legacy that Māori Marston left to me, and I stopped smoking that day.
It's literally a life or death situation. The smoke-free 2025 goals are lofty, they're aspirational, but I'm not sure that they're enough. And that's a shame, because it just means that one generation won't pick up the cigarette packet, but they will pick up the vaping pods. And in the end, have we really done enough to fix this problem? However, perhaps that's at the heart of every public health issue when it's lifestyle related, is that the person who must own responsibility isn't the government, it's the individual. Nobody's putting the cigarette to your mouth, nobody's putting the vape in your hand. You must choose to make good choices that lead to a better tomorrow. And perhaps we need to start teaching our kids less about smoking and more about consequences. What do you think? Have you given up vaping, cigarettes? What do you think? You can check out our website, activeintelligence.nz. Please do subscribe so that every episode comes fresh into your inbox, and we'll catch you next time on Active Intelligence.